Hello and welcome to the first lecture on Chapter 4. So now we're going to talk about consciousness. And consciousness is one of my favorite subjects. And something that all psychologists agree on is that there is very little to agree on about consciousness. There are so many aspects to consciousness. And so we're going to keep it very, very simple. So our definition for the term is that consciousness is the subjective experience of the world and mental activity, and it's the result of brain activity. So consciousness is subjective. We can all be in the same exact moment, but our conscious experience will differ. All of us will have a different experience in the same situation. And consciousness is private, for which I'm very grateful. Now, consciousness is dynamic. Consciousness does not end until we're dead. Brain death, welcome to lack of consciousness. There's no consciousness. But we don't ever go unconscious unless there's traumatic brain injury or some kind of organic brain disorder. We simply vacillate through different levels of consciousness. And we're going to look at that in this chapter. Now, consciousness is self-reflective, and it's central to our sense of self. Without consciousness, there is no me. There's no you. And so consciousness is what we are aware of, and it's what we know that we know. So consciousness is a dynamic process. While the focus of our awareness is changing constantly throughout the day, from moment to moment, our experience of consciousness as unbroken, so as a cohesive experience, helps provide us with an internal sense of personal identity that is continuous from day to day. So, because personality is dynamic, it's continuous. So we always talk about, I just was so unconscious last night. I was so tired. When you're sleeping, you're not unconscious. You're just in an altered state of consciousness. So throughout the day, even when we're asleep, the focus of our awareness changes. But we don't ever have a break in consciousness. So I think of it as, imagine life as a series of snapshots. And so, think about what you did on Saturday afternoon. So you pull up a picture in your mind's eye, and you break it down into snapshots. Well, now you need to put those snapshots in order. Okay, not hard to do. That doesn't tell you much about what was going on in that moment. That gives you pieces. But without consciousness, consciousness is what gives that all context. It's what makes snapshots into moving pictures that flow together. So consciousness gives us this cohesive experience. Whereas if we didn't have this constant dynamic process with consciousness, life would just be a series of snapshots. Conscious experience is a continuous stream of thoughts, but our thoughts often float from one to another to another. And conscious is a unified and coherent experience. There is a limit to how much you can be conscious of at any given time. We are horrible multitaskers. Now, when we were talking about Chapter 3, I think I mentioned that women are slightly better at multitasking, but women are still really horrible at multitasking because the conscious mind can only juggle so much information. And it's much less information than any of us really wants to admit, which I think gets frustrating. This is why you don't text and drive. Your brain can't do it. I know you think you can. I know you think you can do it for just one text message, but you really can't. The brain is not meant to juggle that much information at any given time. Does this mean that our brain can't juggle multiple pieces of information? No. Obviously we're able to, because consciousness is the sense of the alert mind floating from one issue to another, obviously we can process multiple pieces of information at one time, but we cannot multitask. Now there's two components to consciousness. There is the content of consciousness and the level of consciousness. The content is, what are you thinking about in the moment? The level of consciousness has to do with alertness. So, there's awake where you're pretty productive and, you're alert. You notice changes in your surrounding easily. Then there's sleepy. You're not as alert. It's harder for you to notice changes in your environment. You feel sluggish. You just had two different levels of consciousness. And when we talk about sleep, we'll look at how there's multiple stages of consciousness when sleeping. So, while the focus of our awareness is changing constantly, our experience of consciousness is unbroken, helps give us a sense of, gives us an internal sense of personal identity that is continuous from day to day. Having a sense of self, being able to conceptualize who you are, is dependent on consciousness. If consciousness was not continuous, the self would be much, much more difficult to define. It's like those snapshots. The self is more than the snapshots of what we've done throughout the day or what we've thought about throughout the day. And so in order to have a strong internal sense of personal identity that is long-lasting, we need consciousness. Otherwise, we're just playing pictures in the mind. Now, neurologically, consciousness is pretty complicated. Again, we're going to keep it just kind of simple. So there's what's called the global workplace model. And this posits that consciousness arises as a function of which brain circuits are active at any given time. And there's lots of research to support this. And one of the reasons we talk about altered states of consciousness is it's an easy way to look at how brain functioning changes relates to levels of consciousness changes, and levels of consciousness changes and content of consciousness changes. I hope that made sense. So the global workspace model simply states that consciousness arises as a function of which brain circuits are active. So, in the last chapter, we were talking about how different brain areas have different jobs. But to have to have a complete human experience, you need a whole, healthy brain. And consciousness is that way too. So something the global workspace model shows us is that there's no one area of the brain responsible for consciousness or for awareness. So to kind of give you an idea of this, so here we have conscious awareness. We've got all kinds of parts of the brain throwing information to our conscious moment, to this moment in time. So as you're listening to this lecture, you're seeing the slides, you're hearing my voice. You're not so much worried about, space or movement, but the prefrontal cortex is very active because you're trying to comprehend what's being said. You're trying to process the meaning of what I'm talking about. And so in any given time, you're conscious of what the brain sends to conscious awareness, which means there's also a lot going on that you're not conscious of, which is why we're such bad multitaskers. We do know that the unconscious mind exists. It's not in the sense that Freud believed. Freud believed that the unconscious mind was the motivator for most of our behaviors, and that it was dark and very difficult to access. The unconscious mind, in a more contemporary perspective, is that which is operating underneath, but we can access if we try to. If we take a moment to try to access, okay, what is it I was just reflecting on in that moment, you can usually pull that into conscious awareness. But again, your brain can only juggle so much at one time, so the unconscious mind is operating. In this very moment, you've got your conscious mind going on, but there are unconscious processes going on. And so something that's really interesting with consciousness is trying to access that unconscious mind that's influencing you in the moment. Now, one way we can access is through what's called priming. So, sometimes just saying a specific word brings into, so let's say I say the word 2-year-old. Several words. But that's going to pull up, maybe that pulled up for you a picture of a 2-year-old that you know, or some of the things you know about 2-year-olds, like temper tantrums and silly and little, and it's all of a sudden you weren't thinking about 2-year-olds. I said 2-year-olds, and all of a sudden all of this information about 2-year-olds comes to mind. I've triggered one of your schemas. I've triggered your schema for what a 2-year-old is. And a schema is simply a way that your mind categorizes information. It's like a filing cabinet. So you're going to have a schema for what a 2-year-old is versus what a 5-year-old is. Subliminal perception. The Freudian slip. I'm not a big believer in Freudian slips. I think often they're just a slip of the tongue. But I was watching this Oprah episode years and years ago. So Naomi Campbell, supermodel, is known for being a bit of a diva and having a temper. And she had assaulted her personal assistant with a hotel telephone. So she's, doing the interview circuit, trying to rehabilitate her image. And Oprah asks, "Are you ashamed of what you did?" And she said, I am ashamed of my behavior. That's a Freudian slip, I believe. But when someone says, "I am so mad to meet you," come on, we all know what they mean. They're glad to meet you. There's a slip of the tongue, but then there's the Freudian slip. The Freudian slip is where what you really think is coming out, even though you don't want it to come out. Then there's the smart unconscious, and I'm actually going to move this to my next lecture because I have 10 seconds. So I'll see you on lecture 2. Thank you.